Aurora, sirang cinnamon muda asal Francis, hidap dalam bayang sinta yang tak pernah terbalas pada sahabatnya sendiri, Rafael. Naman ketika cinta menjadi suani dan keheningan berubah menjadi luka, Hatter Lewis, pria pendiam berdara Belgia yang justru menawarkan ruang, bukan pelarian. Di tengah lanskap Paris yang dingin dan indah, persahabatan berubah era, kejujuran membuka luka, dan hati-hati yang tersisa perlahan belajar mencintai lagi. Ini adalah kisah tentang cinta segitiga, perdamaian batin, dan keberanian untuk memulai, bahkan jika pilihan itu berarti berjalan sendirian. The skies over Paris were veiled in a light autumn fog that hung low, as though it were trying to conceal the rooftops of the old buildings that lined the slopes of Montmartre. The chill in the air crept through the gaps in her coat, but for Aurora Elise Lindström, the cold was part of the stillness she so cherished. She sat on one of the stone steps that led up to the Sacré-Cœur, surrounded by the copper hues of the fallen leaves. In her lap lay an old leather sketchbook, and in her hand, a graphite pencil danced slowly. Line after line was etched, forming a strong jawline, a faint smile, and eyes that appeared far too often in her dreams. Aurora wore a pale grey wool coat that seemed slightly too big, a light blue knitted scarf draped around her neck, and her blonde hair, left to cascade loosely, was occasionally swept by the breeze. Her blue eyes were fixed on the sketchbook with intense focus, but in reality, she wasn't looking at the paper. She was looking at memories. That face. Raphael Vincent Dumont. Her friend, her university companion since their first year. The man who often sat beside her in their color theory classes, the one who walked her home during torrential rain, the one who bought her warm croissants on the bleakest morning of her life. He was the kindness that came unasked for, the familiarity that grew too comfortable, and without her realizing it, the love that she never dared to voice. Aurora sighed deeply, finishing the curve of Raphael's slightly crooked smile. She remembered how he loved slipping silly jokes into serious conversations, how he would pat her shoulder when they stood together at last semester's exhibition, how his eyes had studied her painting and said, "Aurora, you paint like you're in love with the world." If only Raphael knew that the world Aurora loved was him. From where she sat, Aurora could hear a street artist strumming his guitar, singing an old song in soft French. Tourists passed by, smiling, some sneakily taking photos, mistaking Aurora for part of the artistic atmosphere that Montmartre was so well known for. But Aurora didn't notice them. Her hand continued to move, perfecting the detail of Raphael's worn leather jacket, his favorite jacket, which seemed too old but he wore it every day. Aurora had kept many sketches of Raphael. She had drawn him secretly over the past 2 years, from rough lines to half-finished oil paintings hidden behind her wardrobe. She always told others that it was just practice for facial anatomy. But only Aurora knew that each line held something heavier than mere technique, a longing that couldn't be entrusted to words. She slowly closed her sketchbook. The morning was turning to noon, and the wind grew sharper. In the distance, the church bells rang softly, filling the air with a melancholic sound. Aurora rose from her seat, brushing off the dust from her coat, and tucked her sketchbook into her canvas bag. Her steps were light, but her heart remained heavy. As she descended the stairs, a small memory emerged, the day Raphael had first accompanied her to Montmartre. They had stood in front of an art supply shop. Raphael had mumbled, "You know, this city feels like a living museum. But you make it come alive." At the time, Aurora had only laughed. But now, those words echoed in her mind, lingering, and adding to the ache she had never admitted. Aurora walked down a narrow alley towards Rue de Martyrs, where her favorite art supply shop was. She passed the window of an old bookstore, waved at the dog of the florist who slept beneath the bench. Paris felt beautiful as always, but today Aurora felt alone amidst the crowd. In the art store, she bought a new set of watercolors and a fine brush, then continued on to the bus stop. On the bus, she sat by the window. The city scenery moved slowly outside, but her thoughts lingered on the steps of Montmartre, on Raphael's face, on the unfinished sketch. She gazed out the window, and for a moment, her reflection met her gaze. She wondered to herself, how long would this go on? But the question hung unanswered in the air. By the time Aurora arrived at her apartment, evening was settling in. She opened the door gently, turned on the soft yellow light that illuminated the small room filled with paints, brushes, and art books. She hung her coat, brewed jasmine tea, and then sat at her painting table. There, hidden beneath a pile of papers, was a brown folder with small handwriting, "The sketches never sent." Aurora opened the folder. Inside were dozens of sketches of Rafael's face. Some were just an eye, others complete with backgrounds of their university. She touched one of them with the tip of her finger. That sketch was unfinished. And for some reason, she didn't want to finish it. The sky outside had turned dark blue. The street lamps lit up one by one, casting their glow over a city that never truly slept. Inside her room, Aurora stared out the window, then turned back to the table. She took a fresh sheet of paper, dipped her brush into water, and began painting something different. This time, it wasn't Raphael's face. She painted the stairs of Montmartre, the maple tree in the left corner, and a girl sitting alone in the middle. She painted herself. And for the first time, Aurora felt as though she was saying something real, even though it remained without sound. The skies over Paris had been grey since the morning. Heavy clouds hung above the old buildings, as though the city were preparing to weep. Aurora walked slowly along the sidewalk of Rue Saint-Benoît, clutching a small notebook filled with snippets of poetry and rough sketches, while a worn canvas bag hung from her shoulder. She had just come from the art supply store and planned to stop by Café de Flore for a brief moment, her usual spot where she sat alone in the corner, sipping tea and stealing time to write. The wind blew softly, carrying the scent of toasted bread from the boulangerie across the street. In the distance, the clink of glasses and the sound of a piano from the old café greeted her like a long-awaited embrace. But Aurora slowed her pace when her eyes caught a silhouette she knew all too well. In the corner near the window, sat a man in an old leather jacket, as if it were part of his very being. Rafael. He leaned back casually, his smile visible from a distance. Across from him sat a girl who made time seem to stop. Clara Moretti. Aurora stood frozen, her heart racing, her eyes fixed. Clara wore a long black coat, her dark hair falling loosely around her shoulders, and her grey eyes locked onto Raphael with something that couldn't be explained. Between them were 2 cups of coffee, a slice of millefeuille, and laughter that felt so foreign to Aurora. The way Raphael touched Clara's hand on the table, the way Clara rested her chin in her hand while laughing softly, everything felt like a cracked painting shattering the entire canvas Aurora had built over the past 2 years. Aurora sighed, her body stiff. She wanted to step inside, maybe say hello, or pretend she didn't know. But she couldn't. Her feet were rooted to the sidewalk, as if held by an invisible weight. She stared at Raphael a moment longer. That gaze, she had never received it, not even when they laughed together in the university studio. The gaze Clara now had, completely. Aurora turned her face away, avoiding anyone's gaze, and began to walk away. She didn't know where she was going, but certainly not into that café. Her steps quickened, almost to a run. Raphael and Clara's laughter still echoed, even as she walked 2 blocks away. She stopped at the end of the street, hiding behind an old building with windows full of dried plants. Her chest tightened. Her hands trembled. She opened her notebook and wrote a single line in black ink. "I saw you today, and for the first time, I truly felt invisible." The rain began to fall gently. Tiny drops soaked the paper, erasing the ink. But Aurora didn't care. She closed the book, hugged it to her chest, and leaned against the wall. Her eyes gazed up at the increasingly dark gray sky. Meanwhile, inside Café de Flore, Raphael had no idea that someone's world had just shattered because of him. Clara noticed his occasional daydreaming. She leaned back, crossing her legs, and asked with a half-smile, "You come here often, don't you?" Raphael nodded. "I used to. With Aurora." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Aurora? The friend who always stayed in the studio until late?" "Yeah," Raphael replied, staring out the window. She's unique. I'm comfortable with her. But lately, she's been distant." Clara rested her chin on her hand. Sometimes people pull away not because they don't care, but because they care too much. Raphael turned to her. Clara's words stung lightly. He fell silent for a moment, then laughed softly. "You sound like you know her." "I don't. But I know that way of thinking. I had a friend like Aurora in Milan. And I've been you." Raphael stared at her a little longer. There was something in Clara's words that he didn't fully understand. But he didn't ask more. That day, they talked about art, childhood, and their quirky habits. Rafael learned that Clara liked reading dark poetry. Clara learned that Rafael was afraid of riding in narrow elevators. Time moved slowly, and they seemed trapped in their own little bubble. Meanwhile, Aurora climbed the stairs to the second floor of a small bookstore on Rue de l'Abbé Grégoire. She sat in the corner, opened an old Swedish book, and pretended to read. But her mind drifted far away. She wondered, did Rafael know Clara could make him laugh like that? Had Rafael ever looked at her the way he looked at Clara? And if the answer was no, why did her heart still hope? An hour later, she returned to her apartment. Her body was tired, not from the distance, but from the reality that had slapped her relentlessly. She hung her scarf and coat, then turned on the light in the small room. On the table was the unfinished painting of Rafael. His face only half done, with his eyes still empty. Aurora took her brush, but her hand stopped in midair. She stared at those empty eyes and whispered softly, "Those eyes no longer see me." She put the brush down, then took the painting and hid it beneath the bed, alongside the dozens of sketches she would never show. Night fell. Aurora sat on the edge of her bed, brewing jasmine tea that now tasted too bitter. From her window, the Eiffel Tower was faintly visible, shrouded in mist and light rain. Paris still shimmered out there. But inside that small room, there was only a girl who had just realized that love could make someone feel alone, even in the city that was said to be the most romantic in the world. The rain had continued to fall lightly since the night before. Outside Aurora's small apartment window, the Paris sky had turned into a lifeless gray canvas. The walls of her room felt smaller than usual, and time moved slowly, like paint dripping from a brush onto the wooden floor. That morning, Aurora hadn't gone to campus. She wrapped herself in a warm sweater, sat at her little desk, and opened the notebook that had already been filled with scribbles. Page after page was covered with short poems, colorless sketches, and notes from her heart that she had never shown anyone. She stared at the blank page in the middle of the notebook, then began writing with a black pen. "Rafael, I don't know where to begin. Maybe from the first day we met, when you greeted me even though I was quietly drawing in the corner of the studio. Or from the day you gave me your jacket when we were caught in the rain outside that old gallery. But maybe I should start with the one most honest thing. I've fallen in love with you for too long, too deeply, and too quietly." Her hand stopped. Her breath was heavy. She closed her eyes, then continued. "I know you never asked me to feel this way. You never promised me anything. But I hoped. And that hope was my mistake." Aurora closed the pen and stared at the words for a long time. She lifted the sheet of paper, reading it again. There was a wound laid bare in those sentences, but also a sense of relief. For the first time, her feelings weren't just living in silence, they had transformed into words. She carefully folded the paper, slid it into a white envelope, and wrote Raphael's name on the front. She placed the envelope in the middle of the table. She sat still for a few minutes, not knowing what to do. Should she give him the letter? Keep it? Or burn it? Outside, the sound of car horns echoed faintly from a distance. Then, a knock at the door. Aurora raised an eyebrow as she opened the door. Standing at the threshold was Louis, Raphael's friend. His dark brown hair was wet from the drizzle, and he was holding a folding umbrella dripping with water. "Sorry to bother you," Louis said. "You didn't come to class, I was worried." Aurora gave a thin smile and motioned for him to come in. Louis hung up his jacket, then sat in the same wooden chair Raphael usually occupied when he visited. The room suddenly felt unfamiliar with Louis there, but also a little warmer. "I just needed some time alone," Aurora said, pouring herself tea. Louis looked around the room. His gaze fell on the unfinished painting in the corner of the studio. He recognized the face being painted. He also knew who the subject was. "You paint Raphael often, don't you?" he asked softly. Aurora fell silent. There was no point in lying. Louis was too perceptive. Yes." Louis nodded. "I've known for a while." Aurora looked down, her hands gripping the now cold teacup. She looked at Louis and found something in his gaze, not judgment, not false sympathy, but understanding. "Sometimes love is like an unfinished painting," Louis said quietly. "We keep adding color, but over time, it just gets blurrier." Aurora smiled bitterly. "My painting hasn't had any color for a long time." Louis didn't say anything else. He just looked at her in a way that Rafael never did, attentively, not just as a friend, but as someone who understood what it felt like to love in silence. After Louis left, Aurora returned to the envelope on the table. She picked it up, then slipped it into the drawer. Not now, she thought. Maybe never. Elsewhere, Rafael sat alone in the campus courtyard, his sketchbook open but empty. Clara hadn't arrived yet. Since their meeting at Café de Flore, something had changed. Rafael felt that Clara was keeping her distance, not physically, but emotionally. Her gaze was colder. Her smile no longer warm. When Clara finally arrived, she simply said, "Sorry, I'm late." They sat together, discussing the architecture project they had to complete, but Rafael said little. In the silence, he suddenly thought of Aurora. He remembered the small smile on her face when she stared at her painting. He remembered her soft voice as she read Swedish poetry in the library. Clara noticed the distant look in Rafael's eyes. "You seem distracted," she said flatly. "I'm just thinking about a lot of things," Rafael replied. Clara leaned back in her chair. "If it's about Aurora, you can talk about it." Rafael turned quickly. "No. I'm just worried she might be sick or something. She didn't come in today." Clara shrugged. "Or maybe she just needs space." Rafael didn't reply. But that evening, as he walked home, his steps led him to the front of Aurora's apartment. He stood across the street, staring at the dimly lit window, then turned and walked away without ever knocking. Inside, Aurora was writing again. But this time, it wasn't a letter. She was writing a poem. "If I were the rain, I would fall without a sound, touch you gently, then disappear before you knew I was ever there." The sky over Paris was clear of rain that day. The steps on the École des Beaux-Arts campus echoed loudly since morning, but inside the architecture studio, the atmosphere was quiet and focused. Rafael stood in front of his sketchboard, his left hand holding a large ruler, while Clara sat leaning on the desk with her hair hastily tied up, a pencil between her fingers. "If you shift the foundation line by 2 degrees, the shape will become asymmetrical," Clara said without looking at Rafael. Rafael didn't respond. He slowly redrew the line. The sound of the pencil against paper was stiff. Normally, he enjoyed working with Clara, their ideas complemented each other, their discussions never boring. But today, something was different. There was an empty space between them that could not be bridged by design or lines. "You're not focused," Clara finally said. Rafael stopped drawing. He stared at the desk. "I'm just tired." Clara lowered her feet from the table and looked at him directly. "Tired? Or too many thoughts?" Rafael sighed. He knew where this conversation was heading. "Clara." "I'm not stupid, Raf," Clara interrupted. "You've changed in the past few days. You think I don't see the way you zone out whenever we talk." Rafael didn't answer immediately. He stared at the shadow of Clara's body falling on the floor of the studio from the sunlight streaming through the high windows. The shadow was long and seemed to stretch away, like a reflection of their slowly distancing relationship. "I don't know, Clara," he said finally. "I just feel like I've left something too far behind." Clara chuckled softly, but it wasn't a sweet laugh. It was more like a shield. "Aurora." Rafael looked at her. Clara stood up and tidied the sketches on her desk. "If it's really her you're thinking about, why don't you talk to her directly? Or at least be honest with yourself?" Rafael stood still, shaken by a question he couldn't answer. Meanwhile, in the quiet art studio on the floor above the building, Aurora sat alone. The daylight filtered through the large glass window, casting light on the unfinished painting in front of her. The face in the painting was no longer Rafael's. This time, she painted space. A long corridor with faint light at the end. No figures, no human forms. Just space. Just an emptiness expressed through cold colors. The sound of footsteps made Aurora glance up. Louis entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the downstairs cafe. He walked over and placed 1 cup on Aurora's desk. "If you don't drink something, you're going to become that painting, cold and empty," he said. Aurora smiled. She touched the cup, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "You always know what to say," she said. "Natural talent," Louis replied as he sat on the floor, leaning his back against the wall. They were silent for a moment. Only the sound of the heater could be heard. Louis looked at Aurora's painting. Why the empty space? Aurora stared at her work. Because I don't know who deserves to be in it anymore. Louis nodded slowly. Maybe it's not about who deserves it, but who you allow to come in. Aurora turned to him. Their eyes met. For the first time, Aurora saw Louis not as Rafael's friend, but as himself, someone who saw and stayed. Dusk slowly descended in Paris. The streetlights lit up one by one. Rafael stood on his apartment balcony, looking out at the city. In his hand, he held an old sketch, a painting of Montmartre he had made with Aurora in their first year of college. At the bottom corner of the paper, there was a scribble from Aurora, "We don't need to be big to be eternal." He read that line over and over again. The cold night brought his memories back to the days when Aurora had been the center of his world, though he hadn't realized it. When their laughter had been effortless. When Aurora's smile was the reason he woke up in the morning. That evening, Clara sent a message. "We need time. So do I." Rafael didn't reply. He just placed his phone on the table and lay down. On his bedroom ceiling, the shadows of the trees outside trembled in the wind. He stared at them for a long time, trying to understand which part of him had shifted. In Aurora's room, the dim light flickered on. She sat on the floor, surrounded by old paintings she had taken from under her bed. There were sketches of Rafael's eyes, a side portrait of his face, the silhouette of his body standing by the Seine, and one full painting she had made with oil paints, a painting she had never shown anyone. Aurora touched the canvas. The colors were still fresh, though it had been months since it had been tucked away. In that painting, Rafael stood with his back to the camera, facing the studio window, his body soaking in the morning light. There was a sense of peace and loss in that image. Aurora didn't know whether she wanted to keep it, or burn it. She opened the window of her room, letting the night air in. Paris felt quiet tonight. Not like usual. Maybe because she, too, was quiet. When she turned back into the room, Louis was standing in the doorway. He knocked softly before entering. "Sorry. I know it's late. But I found this poetry book and thought of you," he said, handing her an old book titled Les Fleurs du Mal by Baudelaire. Aurora accepted it. "Thank you." Louis didn't leave immediately. He stood in the doorway. "Aurora, you know you don't always have to be strong on your own." Aurora looked at him. His gaze was sincere. And for the first time, she nodded. Somewhere, Clara sat alone on a park bench. She gazed at the faint stars in the sky that weren't too dark. In her lap was a torn piece of paper with Raphael's building sketch on it. She tore it slowly, then watched the pieces fly away with the wind. She knew she hadn't been completely honest. She knew Raphael wasn't fully hers yet. And she was starting to grow tired of being a shadow for someone whose thoughts were somewhere else. That night in Paris, 3 hearts were connected by an invisible distance. 3 souls searching for something within themselves, while love, once so simple, had now become a long labyrinth that wasn't easy to navigate. The rain had been falling lightly since morning. The streets of Paris gleamed with water pooling between the cobblestones. Wet brown leaves clung to the feet of passers-by, and the scent of damp earth gently spread through the air. Inside the art studio on the second floor of the campus, the windows were fogged up, and the smell of turpentine mixed with the moisture from the rain filled the room. Aurora arrived earlier than usual that day. She wore an old gray wool coat and boots that had lost their shine. Her blonde hair was wet, as she hadn't had time to dry it. She opened the studio door, turned on the light, and sat in the corner of the room. In front of her stood a blank canvas, challenging her. But this morning, she hadn't come to paint. She had come to say the words that had lived only in her mind until now. The door to the studio opened silently. Raphael entered with quick steps. In his hand was a large sheet of paper, the sketch of Aurora that had been left behind a few days ago. His expression was confused, nervous, and surprised all at once. "I found this on the back table," he said, holding up the paper. "You drew this?" Aurora looked up. Her gaze was flat. She didn't look shocked, nor angry. Just tired. "That wasn't for you to see," she said softly. Raphael stepped closer. The sketch revealed his face in deep detail. His eyes, his crooked smile, his jawline, Everything was captured like an unspoken confession. He stared at Aurora. Why didn't you ever say anything? Aurora stood slowly. Her figure seemed small in front of Rafael, who was taller, but her voice was firm. I've kept all of this for 2 years. I painted you because you were the most comfortable space I've ever had. But I know my limits. I know my place. Rafael wanted to speak, but Aurora beat him to it. Then I saw you with Clara. At the cafe. You looked at her the way I once dreamed you would look at me. And that's when I realized, all this time, I've been living in a shadow. Aurora's voice cracked. But she didn't cry. It was only the suffocation behind each word that was clear. Rafael seemed devastated. Aurora. I didn't know you'd kept all of this. It's not your fault, Aurora interrupted. It's my fault for hoping. The studio was silent. The rain tapped against the glass windows like an impatient heartbeat. Rafael stared at the floor. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say. He knew he had lost something he never realized he had. Aurora walked to the wooden cabinet in the corner of the studio. She opened a drawer and pulled out a folder filled with dozens of sketches. She handed it to Rafael. Take it. It's all yours. I don't need them anymore. Rafael looked at the stack, then back at Aurora. Are you sure? Aurora nodded. It's time for me to paint for myself, not for someone who never even saw me as someone. Rafael opened one of the sheets. There, he saw himself smiling, looking at something outside the window. The image was full of love, so intimate, so real. It felt like he was staring at a memory that wasn't his. Just as he was about to speak again, the studio door opened. Louis stood there, frozen, watching Rafael and Aurora face each other. I can come back later, he said quickly, about to leave. Aurora turned. No. Come in. Louis stepped inside, giving Rafael a sharp but calm look. Rafael nodded at him, then decided to leave. But before he walked out, he turned back to Aurora. I'm sorry. I really didn't know. Aurora remained silent. No words could heal a wound that had already run too deep. After the door closed, Louis walked closer. Are you okay? Aurora took a deep breath. I don't know. Louis sat beside her. They were silent for a long time. Outside, the rain grew heavier. You know, Louis spoke softly. Sometimes we have to lose someone to realize that the person we loved wasn't really them, but the version of them we created ourselves. Aurora looked at him, her eyes wet, but not crying. Did you ever feel that way? Louis nodded. I did. And it took a long time to forgive myself for hoping too much. Aurora smiled faintly. You always come at the right time. Louis looked at her. Because I've never really left. That afternoon, Rafael stood on the Pont Neuf bridge. In his hand, he still clutched Aurora's sketches. The evening wind blew through his hair, carrying the cold, sharp scent of the Seine River. He looked at the sheets one by one. Each image felt like a message he had failed to receive in time. Clara sent a message. Asterisk, I think you need time. So do I. Asterisk. Rafael read the message without replying. He knew there were 2 doors he had opened too wide, and both were now slowly closing, not because of hatred, but because of wounds that couldn't be shared equally. He placed one sketch on the bridge's railing. Then another. The wind carried them away, floating in the air before they finally fell into the water. Rafael looked down. The papers floated for a moment, then disappeared, swallowed by the current. He didn't know if it was a form of loss, or the beginning of something else. That night, Aurora and Louis sat in a small café on Rue de Rennes. Yellow lights hung low, and soft classical music played from an old radio in the corner. They didn't talk much. Aurora ordered jasmine tea, and Louis had espresso without sugar. After a few minutes of silence, Aurora asked, Do you believe people can heal from a broken heart? Louis looked at her. I believe. People can learn to live with the break. And sometimes, through the cracks, light can get in. Aurora smiled. You really love to speak in metaphors, don't you? Louis shrugged. I like the way words heal, just like you believe paintings can speak. Aurora gazed at her cup. In the silence, her heart slowly felt something different. Not love that suddenly appeared. Not a replacement for Rafael, but a small space that was beginning to open, a space for herself. And that night, for the first time in a long time, Aurora slept without bringing Rafael's face into her dreams. The sky over Paris was grey, like a painting forgotten in the middle of its process. The autumn wind blew, scattering the old leaves along the banks of the Seine River. On the Pont d'Arts, the Bridge of Lovers, the love locks from the past still hung on the iron railings, though some were rusted and the names written on them had begun to fade. Aurora stood there alone. Her dark blue wool coat shielded her small frame from the wind, while her blonde hair blew in all directions. In her hand, she clutched a small piece of paper and an empty lock. Not to lock love, but to release what had lived only in silence for so long. She stared at the water beneath the bridge, then opened the folded paper she had written the night before. On it were the few short words. I once loved you more than enough, though you never knew. A.L. Her hands trembled as she attached the paper to the lock's handle. Then with a click, she secured it to the bridge's railing, among the thousands of other stories. She didn't write Raphael's name. She didn't write a date. Just a fragment of a sentence that became the closure to the long painting of her life. Someone approached. Soft footsteps, the sound of leather shoes meeting the wooden bridge. Aurora didn't turn. She knew that sound. Why did you choose this bridge? Louis asked quietly. Aurora took a deep breath. Because I wanted to leave something, in a place full of memories but not mine. Louis stood beside her, staring at the lock she had just attached. If you want to let go, why do you lock it? Aurora turned and gave a small smile. Sometimes we have to lock the wound before we can truly move on. Louis didn't answer. He just stood there, in the silence that was full of understanding. From afar, the Eiffel Tower peeked out from behind the mist. Paris was still captivating, but no longer dazzling. Just an honest stillness, and the wind that continued to move. In another corner of the city, Clara sat alone in the small gallery room where she often arranged design works. She stared at the blank white wall in front of her, trying to imagine a new concept, but her mind couldn't stray far from Aurora's face. A face so calm yet full of wounds. A face she had seen in the corridor a week ago, when Aurora and Raphael stood in silence facing each other. Clara massaged her temples. She knew from the beginning, Raphael had never truly been present for her. He was only partly there. And the rest of him, always seemed to be directed toward Aurora. She took a deep breath and sent a short message. Aurora, if you're willing, I'd like to talk. Clara. There was no reply. But Clara stared at her phone screen longer, as if waiting for the voice of someone she had hurt without ever meaning to. That night, Aurora sat on her bed with her hair still wet from the shower. Baudelaire's poetry book, given to her by Louis, lay open in her lap. The dim yellow light made soft shadows dance on her bedroom walls. On the side of her desk, a white envelope sat. A letter for Raphael. A letter that she had never given. Her hand briefly touched it, then pulled away. Not anymore. She took a fresh sheet of paper and wrote a single sentence. I am learning to love without holding on. A.L. She slipped the paper inside the pages of the poetry book. That night, she felt a little lighter. Her phone buzzed. A message from Louis. Are you asleep? Aurora quickly replied. Not yet. Why? Louis replied swiftly. I'm outside your apartment. Can I show you something? Aurora smiled. She put on her jacket and opened the door. Louis stood there, holding 2 tickets in his hand. A night art exhibition. Outdoors. One night only, Louis said. You need some fresh air. Aurora nodded. Let me grab my scarf. They arrived at the Jardin du Palais Royal, where the urban art exhibition was held outdoors with small lights hanging between the old trees. In the center of the garden, an art installation made of transparent canvases swayed gently in the wind. Light projections displayed short poems and abstract images that changed every minute. Aurora stood in the middle of the garden, staring at the canvas screen that displayed a poem from someone she didn't know. You are not what you lost. You are what you became after losing. M.G. Louis stood beside her. Sometimes we come to places like this not to see the art, but to see ourselves, from the outside. Aurora nodded. Her eyes were still on the light, but her thoughts began to settle. She realized that pain wasn't always bad. Sometimes, it shapes something more honest, stronger, and more complete. On the other side of the garden, a photographer secretly took pictures of them. Two silhouettes stood in the light, not touching, but appearing to complement each other. Louis turned to Aurora. "You look more at peace tonight." Aurora looked at him. "I'm still learning. But I feel I'm heading in the right direction." They walked slowly through the garden, letting the Paris night wrap around them without haste. Their steps weren't rushed. There was no clear destination. But that didn't matter. Because tonight, for the first time, Aurora didn't feel alone. The rain had cleared since the afternoon, leaving the sidewalks gleaming with water and the air feeling cold yet fresh. The Paris sky had turned a silvery blue, and the afternoon light filtered through the yellowing leaves along the Jardin du Luxembourg. On a long bench near the round pond that reflected the colors of the sky, Aurora sat alone, wearing a cream coat with a gray scarf wrapped around her neck. She held a warm cup of coffee she'd brought from a small cafe near the entrance to the park. In front of her, small birds pecked at pieces of baguette that had fallen from the park bench. She had come early, her feelings mixed. The message from Clara 2 days ago still spun around in her mind. And now, this afternoon, they would speak. The sound of approaching footsteps made Aurora look up. Clara stood a few steps away from her, wearing a long black coat and brown boots. Her black hair fell loosely, and her face looked a little more tired than usual. "Aurora," Clara greeted softly. Aurora nodded. "Please sit." Clara sat down calmly, but there was a tension in her shoulders that was hard to hide. They sat in silence for a moment, letting the sound of the fountain and the laughter of children playing in the distance fill the gap of conversation that hadn't started yet. "I know, you probably don't want to hear anything from me," Clara began finally. "But I need time, because I need to be honest." Aurora looked at her, neither cynical nor warm. "We're sitting here, Clara. So speak." Clara lowered her gaze for a moment before she spoke again. "I know you've liked Rafael for a long time. I could see it even before I got to know him better. But I still went ahead. Because back then, I thought you would never say anything, and Rafael, he never talked about you as anything more than a friend." Aurora bit her lower lip. She knew part of that was true, but the pain was still there. "I was wrong for being silent, Aurora. I was wrong for pretending I didn't know, and I was wrong for continuing when my heart wasn't fully there." "Why?" Aurora finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. Clara stared straight ahead, at the fountain reflecting the slowly descending sunlight. "Because I was tired of feeling alone. Because Rafael seemed like someone who could make me feel important. But it turns out, what I was searching for wasn't him." Aurora lowered her gaze. The pain was still there, but slowly starting to ease. Clara continued. "Rafael, he's too lost in doubt. He loves something he thinks he doesn't deserve to chase. And me. I was in the way." Aurora took a deep breath. "You know I don't hate you?" Clara turned quickly, almost disbelieving. "I'm angry, yes. But not because you love Rafael. But because we all stayed silent. We all pretended." Clara nodded slowly. "We're all hurt by the silence." A brief silence passed. "Are you happy now?" Aurora asked finally. Clara smiled faintly. "I'm learning not to pin my happiness on someone uncertain. I left not because I lost, but because I wanted to return to myself." Aurora looked at Clara for a longer moment. For the first time, she saw not a rival, not an obstacle, but another woman who, too, was trying to love the best she could, even if sometimes in the wrong direction. "I hope you find your place," Aurora said quietly. Clara looked at her. "And I hope you forgive yourself." They sat quietly until the sun had fully set. The park lights began to flicker on one by one, casting long shadows on the grass. When Clara stood, she extended her hand. Aurora took it. That afternoon's farewell was not an end, but a new space that they could finally fill with peace. Elsewhere in the city, Rafael sat alone in the campus studio. The neon light illuminated his sketch desk, but the paper in front of him remained empty. Beside him, the sketches from Aurora were still neatly folded. He hadn't dared open them again. Not because he feared seeing his own face, but because he was afraid of seeing the love he hadn't protected. His head was filled with scattered thoughts. About Clara, about Aurora, about himself who had never known for sure what he wanted until it was too late. His phone buzzed. A message from Clara. "I've spoken with Aurora. Thank you for everything, but I'm stepping away from this story now. We all need space to heal." Rafael stared at the screen for a long time. He knew when Clara left, all that remained was honesty. And in the face of that honesty, he felt exposed. That night, Louis stood outside Aurora's apartment, holding 2 cups of hot chocolate from the shop near Rue Vavin. He knocked softly. Moments later, Aurora opened the door with a tired but gentle expression. "Hot chocolate. For a night that's been too honest," Louis said. Aurora smiled, letting him in. They sat together on the living room floor, leaning against the wall, letting the night pass without haste. "Did you meet with Clara?" Louis asked. Aurora nodded. "We talked. For a long time. But it feels good." Louis sipped his hot chocolate. "Sometimes, the wounds we close too tightly end up making us limp. But if we open them, heal them, we can learn to stand again." Aurora looked at Louis. "You always have a calm way of speaking." Louis smiled. "Because I've never wanted to be the center. I just want to be the place." Aurora fell silent. Those words seeped in slowly, but echoed for a long time. She rested her head against the wall, letting her body relax. And that night, there was no love that had to be forced. No past that had to be denied. Just 2 people sitting side by side, understanding each other in the quiet of Paris, which was starting to grow cold. Autumn was nearing its end. Orange and brown leaves piled up along Rue Monsieur le Prince, drying and rustling as the wind passed. Paris trembled softly in the silence of the season. Time felt slow, but it continued its relentless march, indifferent to the hearts left behind. That morning, Rafael stood in front of Aurora's apartment door. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the anxiety that had long settled in his chest. He had stood there for over 10 minutes, listening to his heartbeat grow increasingly erratic. In his hand, a letter. Not a sketch. Not a poem. Just a few paragraphs that he had finally managed to write after days of holding on to regret. He raised his hand and knocked gently on the door. Moments later, the door opened. Aurora stood in the doorway, wearing a cream sweater with her hair hastily tied up, a dab of paint on the sleeve of her shirt. "Oh," she said quietly. "Hi." Rafael nodded. His eyes searched her face, perhaps for the remnants of warmth from before, or at least a small space for an explanation. But he found neither. Can we talk for a moment?" he asked. Aurora paused for a second, then gave a small nod. "Please." They sat at the small wooden table by the window. On the table, a cup of warm tea still steamed, and a poetry book was open to the middle page. Rafael sat up straight, his hand still holding the letter. "I wrote this for you," he said, handing over the white envelope. Aurora didn't immediately take it. Her gaze fell to the envelope, then back to Rafael's face. "Why now?" she asked. The question was simple, but sharp. Rafael was silent. I've held all of this in for too long. I thought I could control my feelings, divide the space between you and Clara. But it turns out I failed. And I lost both of you." Aurora looked out the window. A light drizzle began to fall, hesitating. Then she spoke, softly but firmly. "You didn't lose me, Raf. You just arrived too late at the place I used to live." Rafael clenched his fingers together. "I don't know how to apologize for this." Aurora shook her head. "You don't have to apologize. Because now, I'm no longer the girl who waited for you in the corner of the studio. I've learned to let go, not because I stopped loving you, but because I finally learned to love myself first." Her words hit Rafael in the silence. He lowered his gaze, hiding a feeling that no longer had a place. "I'm glad you came," Aurora continued. "But we're no longer 2 people standing on the same spot." Rafael nodded slowly. He stood up, leaving the letter on the table. "Keep it, or throw it away. It's up to you." Aurora didn't respond. She only stared at the letter for a long time, as if it were a symbol of the past finally brought to light, only to be truly released. When the door closed, Aurora took a deep breath. She touched the letter, then slipped it between the pages of her poetry book. She didn't read it. Days passed. Louis came, bringing a new canvas he had bought for Aurora. They walked together along the banks of the Seine, enjoying the sunny afternoon in silence. In Aurora's hand, a warm croissant from her favorite bakery. Louis carried 2 bottles of peach juice. "You know," Louis said suddenly, "I almost stopped painting." Aurora turned to him quickly. "Why?" Louis smiled, gazing at the flowing river. "Because my father said painting wouldn't give me a life. He wanted me to become a lawyer. I tried following his wishes. 2 years studying law, then I dropped out." "And then you went back to art?" Louis nodded. "But it took time. It took courage. It took loss." Aurora fell silent. She heard those words not just as a story from the past, but as a reflection of herself. How much courage it took to return to being herself after being broken. Louis continued, his voice quieter. "You know, the first time I saw you, you were standing alone in a small gallery near Street Germain. You stood for a long time in front of a painting of pure black. Other people were confused, but you seemed to understand that emptiness." Aurora looked at Louis. "You remember that day?" "Of course. It was the day I realized that being alone isn't always silent. Sometimes, it has its own language." They walked again. Under a small bridge, a group of street musicians played a soft tune on an accordion and guitar. Aurora and Louis stopped listening. There was no long conversation. But the feeling was there. Calm, real, and not in a hurry. That evening, Aurora opened the poetry book again. The letter from Rafael was still tucked inside. She took it, stared at it for a long time, then slowly opened it. Rafael's handwriting filled the page. "Aurora, you are the most complex painting I've ever seen. I was too busy looking for symmetry, forgetting that true beauty comes from the courage to be imperfect. Maybe you've gone far from where I stand. But I'm writing this to tell you that in all my silence, you were the voice that kept echoing. Thank you for loving me, even when I didn't know how to love myself." Aurora smiled faintly. No tears. Just a warmth that slowly wrapped around her heart. She folded the letter back and tucked it in the drawer. That night, she wrote a single sentence in her journal. "We don't always get what we love. But we always have the choice to love in a way that sets us free." A.L. And as she closed the book, she knew her life had reached a new chapter. The sun rose slowly in the Paris sky, casting a soft light on the tops of old stone buildings that warmed the skin. In her small studio, Aurora sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by unfinished paintings. The morning air was still cold, but she left the window open, letting the breeze play through her loose blonde hair. Before her, a new canvas stood. Blank. But this morning felt different. There was no pressure to fill it. No anxiety to perfect it. She simply sat, allowing silence to enter, and slowly she began to paint, not anyone's face, not a shadow of the past but a space. A vast, light-filled space, with a small point in the middle, still undecided. A few moments later, the door knocked. Louis appeared, carrying 2 warm croissants in a paper bag, a wide smile on his face. "I knew you'd forget breakfast," he said, handing her the bag. Aurora smiled. "How did you know I was painting?" "Because you always forget to eat when you start making something from the heart." They sat side by side on the floor, facing the canvas that was slowly beginning to take shape. Louis watched the faint strokes of color in the middle. "You don't know what you want to paint yet?" he asked. Aurora nodded. "I just want to make something that doesn't have to have great meaning. Just honest. Just real." Louis looked at her. "Sometimes that's the best work." Aurora turned to him. Their gazes met, not in awkwardness, nor in rushing emotions. Just the look of 2 people who had begun to understand each other, without many questions, without the need to hurry. That afternoon, Raphael walked alone through the narrow streets of Montmartre. His hands were in the pockets of his worn leather jacket. In his mind, the voices of Clara and Aurora kept echoing, not as regretful explosions, but as soft reverberations, gently touching but continuous. He stopped in front of a small gallery, the same one where he and Aurora had once stood for a long time, staring at paintings by local artists that used shades of misty colors. The gallery was still there. But now, behind the glass window, it wasn't Aurora standing there. Only his own reflection. Rafael walked again. This time toward the campus building. He entered the studio where he used to work, now empty and silent. He opened a drawer, pulled out an old rolled-up sketch that he had never finished. He spread it out on the table. There, a half-finished building stood, surrounded by empty space. He stared at it for a long time, then took a pencil and began to redraw. But the more he sketched, the more he realized, nothing could be finished if the foundation was cracked. He put the pencil down. Silent. Then for the first time, he cried. Without sound. Without grand gestures. Just tears that fell slowly onto the paper. The day turned to night. Aurora and Louis were on the balcony of Louis's apartment, facing the Paris sky now filled with stars. They sat side by side on the long bench, legs crossed, hands holding warm teacups. I used to have nightmares, Aurora suddenly said. About the days when I waited for someone who didn't even know I was waiting. Louis turned to her. Do you still have them? Aurora shook her head. Now I wake up and know, I'm not waiting for anyone anymore. Louis smiled. You know what I admire most about you? What? You dare to feel. Aurora fell silent. Then slowly, she rested her head on Louis's shoulder. No words of love were spoken, no promises made. But that night, their silence was the truest confession. In a small cafe near the Sorbonne, Rafael sat with Clara. They didn't touch. They didn't look at each other for long. Only 2 cups of coffee cooling on the table between them. I'm going to Lyon, Clara said. There's an architecture art program for 6 months. Rafael nodded. When do you leave? Tomorrow. They were silent. I'm not a bad person, Raf, Clara continued. But I've waited for you to choose for too long. Rafael looked out the window. And I've waited too long to choose. Clara smiled faintly. We didn't fail. We just had the wrong timing. They looked at each other. And in that gaze, there was no anger. Only the exhaustion that finally found its final word. When Clara stood and left, Rafael didn't chase her. He just sat there, staring at his coffee, realizing that today, for the first time, there was no woman waiting for him. And that was the moment that should have come long ago. That night, Aurora opened her bedroom window. The cold air entered slowly, touching her warm skin after the shower. She stood there for a long time, gazing at the streetlights glowing yellow in the distance. The sound of Paris at night was soft, a train passing far away, footsteps fading, and in the distance, a street singer singing an old song in French that she didn't understand, but it felt familiar. She took her notebook. She wrote one line. Love doesn't always come as destiny. Sometimes it comes as a choice. A yell. Soon after, her phone buzzed. A message from Louis. Are you still awake? Aurora smiled. She replied. Always for you. Winter had begun to gently bite Paris. The rain no longer fell like it did the month before, but the wind carried a biting chill that slowly whitened the rooftops of the city. Along Rue de Fleuris, the leaves had all fallen, leaving behind black branches that stood fragile beneath the gray sky. Aurora stood in front of the newly renovated Independent Art Gallery. Behind the glass, the exhibition poster with her name displayed neatly, E-Space in Time, a solo exhibition by Aurora E. Levine. A piece of paper beneath it explained the theme, space and silence. This exhibition wasn't about painting faces, not portraits of love or loss. It was about space, empty, silent, and beautiful in its own way. She opened the door. The smell of fresh paint and wood filled the air. Louis was already waiting inside, standing in the middle of the room, surrounded by white panels with Aurora's paintings hanging between them. He wore a dark wool sweater and gray jeans, his curly hair slightly tousled. He turned when Aurora entered and smiled. I thought you'd be late. Aurora walked closer and smiled. I just needed a moment to stop shaking. Louis raised an eyebrow. Why? This isn't your first exhibition. Aurora gazed at her paintings hanging on the walls. Soft colors. Shades of gray, pale blues, muted yellows, and whites that were never quite white. None of them depicted faces. There was no Rafael. No image of herself. Just space. Because this is the first time I'm showing something truly from within me. Not from anyone I've loved. Louis nodded. He stepped closer, gently touching her shoulder. This is incredible. You know that, right? Aurora nodded. But her eyes were slightly wet. Soon, people started to arrive. Students, professors, old friends, and even Clara came, standing at the back of the room, wearing a dark purple coat and a white scarf. Their eyes met briefly. No greetings, but also no animosity. Just a silent acknowledgement that the wounds that once felt sharp had now turned into scars closed by time. Among the crowd, Rafael also came. He stood alone in the corner, wearing a gray jacket and a black scarf. His face was calmer, his hair a little shorter. He didn't come to ask for anything back. He came only to see, and to acknowledge, that the person now standing in the middle of the room was no longer the girl he once knew. Not the Aurora who waited, but a woman who had chosen her own path. He stared at one of the paintings, just a simple curved line in the middle of a white space. No bright colors. No details. But from a distance, Rafael knew, that was the most honest painting. After an hour, Aurora stepped out to the back terrace of the gallery. She needed some air. The night was starting to fall, and the stars were hidden behind the clouds. Louis followed her, bringing 2 glasses of white wine. "They like your exhibition," he said, handing her one of the glasses. Aurora nodded. "I like it too. Not because of them, but because finally, I can see myself in those walls." Louis stared at her for a long time. "Have you ever regretted it?" Aurora sighed. "I've regretted being silent. I've regretted waiting. But now? No." She turned to Louis, looking into his eyes, which from the start had never offered an escape, only a peaceful space. "You know," she said, "I never really knew what mature love looked like. But I think if love comes without forcing, without demanding, without having to be the center of everything, maybe that's the love that's enough." Louis smiled. He placed his glass down and extended his hand. Aurora took it. "Not all wounds need to be healed," Louis continued. "Sometimes we just need someone brave enough to sit with us, even if the wound hasn't completely healed." Aurora looked at the sky. The night air pierced her skin, but she didn't feel cold. That night, they sat together on the terrace, beneath the starless Paris sky. There were no promises. No words of love that needed to be spoken. Just 2 hands holding each other, and a silence that was enough to contain everything. A few weeks later, Aurora walked alone on the Pont Alexandre III, the grand bridge over the Seine with golden statues on either side. The winter wind blew sharper, making her scarf dance gently in the air. She stared at the water below. Then, she opened her bag, pulling out a small silver lock. On one side of the lock, engraved were the initials, A.L. Not for Rafael. Not for Louis. But for herself. She attached the lock to the bridge's railing. Then, she locked it. A fastening, not a promise to anyone else, but a small vow to herself, that she would continue creating, and continue feeling, even if the world didn't always give her the return she hoped for. She stood there for a long time, not waiting for anyone to come. And when she turned to leave, her steps were light, her body at ease, and her eyes looking straight ahead. The steps of a woman who had stopped chasing, because she finally knew, she didn't need to belong to anyone, to feel enough. And in the quiet streets of Paris, beneath skies that aren't always blue, they learned that not all love must be possessed, not all wounds need to be healed. Sometimes, what matters most isn't who stays at the end of the story, but who dares to let go, and who dares to love themselves first. Thank you for being with us until this point. See you in the next story.